Hey, welcome to Draft Academy. My name is Mike. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about variables in PHP. Now, a lot of times in our PHP programs, we're going to be dealing with all sorts of data and information. And a lot of times, we're going to want to be able to maintain and keep track of that data in our programs. And we can actually use variables in order to do that. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys the basics of working with variables and using variables. And we're gonna kind of get up to speed with what variables are. So down here in my PHP tags, I have this very simple program set up, and it's basically just echoing out a bunch of text onto the screen. So it's saying there once was a man named George. He was 70 years old. He really liked the name George, but didn't like being 70. So this is basically like a little story that I wrote, and all this program does is write that story out onto the screen. So you can see over here on my browser, it just is printing out that story. So everything works. This is a valid program, right? You'll notice that it's very simple. But let's say that inside of my story, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking to myself, I think I want to change the character's name. Well, in order to do that, I can basically just go into my story, and every place the character's name is mentioned, I can just change it. So let's say instead of being named George, I want the character to be named John. So I'm going to come over here and we'll change this to John, and we can change this down here to John as well. So now I've successfully updated the character's name, right? So every place in the story where the character's name was mentioned, I updated it to the new value. And let's say that I'm looking at my story again and I'm thinking, I think I also want to change the character's name. Well, I could basically do the same thing, right? I could head down here, and everywhere the character's age is mentioned, I can change it. So why don't we change the character's age to be a little younger, maybe 35, right? So I'll change it up here, and then I'll also change it down here. So now I've updated the character's name, and I've updated the character's age inside of my program. So now if we were to refresh the page, you'll see that all of that information got updated in the story, right? So that works perfectly, right? It makes sense. But here's the problem though. In order for me to change the character's name and for me to change the character's age, I had to go through and manually modify both of those attributes, right? I had to manually go in here and change the name in both of these spots, and I had to do the same thing for the age. And this is fine for a story with 4 lines, right? But imagine that this story was like hundreds of lines, and we mentioned the character's name hundreds of times, and we mentioned the character's age hundreds of times. Well, having to go in and manually change their name or manually change their age, if I wanted to update it, would be extremely tedious and difficult, right? And I would probably make a mistake somewhere, where I wouldn't catch it. And this is actually a situation where we can use something called a variable. So a lot of times in our programs, we're going to have certain pieces of information or certain data values that we want to keep track of, and we want to sort of organize. And in this case, we have 2 pieces of information, the character's name and the character's age. So what we can do is we can actually take these values and we can store them in something called a variable. And a variable is basically just a container where we can store pieces of information in our program. So I could create a variable, and then I could store the character's age and the character's name inside of it. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create 2 variables, one for the name and one for the age. And I'm just going to come over here, and right above this echo instruction, I'm going to make a new instruction. And basically we're going to create a variable, which again is just a container. Now, anytime you want to create a variable in PHP, the first thing we have to do is type in this $sign. So whenever you type a $sign like that, it's basically telling PHP that you want to create a variable. So after the $sign, we want to name our variables. So remember, a variable is just a container where we're storing a piece of information. So what I want to do is I want to give this variable a descriptive name, which will tell me what piece of information is stored inside of it. So in our case, I'm going to call this character name because it's going to store the character's name. So I'm just going to say character name. And now that I've given this a name, I want to give this a value. So I can just say character name, and I can just say equals, and I'm going to make these quotation marks, and I'm just going to type out the character's name, John. And then, like always, I'm going to put a semicolon there to end off the instruction. And so down below here, we also want to make another variable. So we also, in addition to storing the character's name, John, we also want to store their age. So once again, I'm just going to type a $sign, and now I'm going to call this variable character age. and I'm going to set this equal to the character's age, which is going to be 35. So you'll notice over here, when I wanted to store text inside of a variable, I had to use these quotation marks. And when I wanted to store a number inside of a variable, I could just type out the number like that. And that's kind of different ways that we can store information. So now that we've stored the character's name and the character's age inside of variables, what I can do is I can actually replace every instance of the character's name and age inside of the story with that variable. And you'll see in a second why that can be useful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to my story, and over here, for example, we're typing out the character's name. So instead of having to type out John, what I could actually do is I could get rid of this, and inside of this little string of text here, I could just type a $sign, and now I can type in the name of the variable that I want to place inside of here. So I could just type out character name. And you'll see that this is actually getting highlighted a different color. And basically, when we put this $sign and we type out the variable name here in this text, so in between these quotation marks, this is telling PHP that we want to insert the value that's stored inside of this variable into our little print statement here. So now if I was to come over here and I was to refresh the web page, you'll see that we're still printing out there once was a man named John, but we didn't actually type out John. Remember, all we did was we just included this variable name over here in the story. And it was actually able to show up over here on the website. And so what PHP did was it saw that we wanted to include the value of the character name variable inside of here, and it went up, grabbed the value, and basically just inserted it here into our story. So we can actually do that now for every occurrence of the character's name. So I could come down here and I could do the same thing. So I'm going to say character name, and we can do the same for the character's age. So down here we have character's age. So I'm just going to type in character age, and then over here we can do the same thing. So I'm just going to do character age. And so now, even though I'm not physically typing out 35 and John, these are still going to show up in my story. So you'll see over here, we get the same exact thing. It's still using the name John, and it's still using the age 35. So what's useful about these variables is that they allow us to store and manage these different values in our programs, these different pieces of information that we're using in our programs. So let's say that now I wanted to update the character's name. Instead of having to go through and manually change it in all the places in my story, I can actually just come up here and I can modify it. So let's say I wanted to change the character's name to Tom. Well, I could just type Tom over here in one spot. So I change the variable in one place, and now it's going to automatically be updated throughout my story. So now when I refresh my program, you'll see instead of using the name John, it's using the name Tom. I could do the same thing for the age. So why don't we make him 80 years old? And now Tom is going to be 80 years old over here in my program. So that is a really awesome way that we can maintain and keep track of the different pieces of information in our programs. And really the point is that I can use this character name variable, and then if I want to change the value, I just change it up here when I assign it a value. And another cool thing that we can do with these variables is we can actually modify them throughout our program. So let's say that halfway through this story, I wanted to change the character's name. What I could do is I could actually come down here and I'm going to make a new line. And let's say halfway through the story, we'll change the character's name. I could just say $, character name, and I could just give this a new value. So I could just give this the value of like Mike, for example. And now halfway through our story, the character's name is going to change from Tom to Mike. So you'll see over here, the first part of the story, it's using the name Tom. And the second part of the story, it's using the name Mike. And basically, you can just update these variables as you go through your program. You can like change their values and do different things with them. So that's kind of the basics of variables. Variables are containers where we can store different pieces of information that we want to keep track of in our program. Now you'll notice that not all pieces of information are going to get stored in variables. So for example, I didn't store like the word once or the word man inside of a variable, right? I stored the pieces of information that I was using multiple times throughout my program, like the character's name and the character's age. These are both values that I could store about the character, and therefore I put them in variables in order to make them easier to use. And then whenever I wanted to access those values, I just referred to the variable's name instead of having to physically type out the value. So that's really the basics of variables. And you'll see over here, we're able to store text inside of variables. We're also able to store numbers inside of variables. And there's also some other different types of data that we can store and represent and work with in PHP. And in the next tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys all about the different data types that we can represent in PHP. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to Draft Academy to be the first to know when we release new content. Also, we're always looking to improve, so if you have any constructive criticism or questions or anything, leave a comment below. Finally, if you're enjoying Draft Academy and you want to help us grow, head over to draftacademy.com/contribute and invest in our future.